So I'm going to introduce Julius. He describes himself as a disciplinary nomad and is very embedded with complexity. Julius, over to you.
Well, hello. Nice to meet you. My name's Julius. And this is an image of the piece that I've got out in the crossing, which is just a kind of a go-in, because metaphor as a way of explaining systems. I've worked quite a lot with complexity and with experts, scholars and academics in complex systems theory. And it's a way of looking at the world in terms of its interconnection, the relationship between component parts and the wholes that they are part of. And in my piece, I look at three different ways of looking at human beings, but one of them is, I'm only going to zoom in on one, because we've got a short amount of time, and I want to go deep as opposed to broad in this particular instance. So I'm going to look at thought and cognition, the way that we all think. And what I'm going to do is embed that in a metaphor, and explain a little bit why metaphor is so important, because there's a metaphoric architecture that underlies my work, and it's the nature of metaphor and how it affects our thinking, how it affects the brain, and how it affects the way that we handle information, comprehension. So I'm going to go a little bit more into that. Is it up or down? Are we changing? Okay. Okay, so metaphor. So in cognitive linguistics, which is a field of science that looks at the relationship between language and language systems and the brain, how we think, metaphor has emerged as a really interesting, there's a theory of metaphor as basically an underlying neural architecture, or a way of linking different parts of the brain together when we process information. And Lakoff and Johnson were the guys that put forward or consolidated this theory most powerfully. And so, yeah, here are a few things that it does. It's a catalyst to understanding. When we put a metaphor to something very complicated, we can condense it, collapse it down into a model that we can comprehend and use easily, straight from the outset. And our ordinary conceptual system, how we get about, how we think and we act, is at its very basis, according to their theory, metaphoric. So say, for example, in quite a lot of the sciences, but I'm going to use the neuroscience as a discipline for an example, a lot of our understanding is directed by metaphor. And in fact, the way that we look at problems is metaphor. So if we look at the attention network in the human brain, or attention networks, plural, the way that we pay attention and what we pay attention to, our understanding of those, in many different theories, is directed by metaphor. There are metaphors, the filter metaphor, the attenuator theory, the zoom lens theory, and they all describe different facets of attention through different metaphors, which highlight certain aspects of them. They allow us to describe very complex things in quite simple, collapsed terms. And so if we turn this idea of metaphor as a kind of a way, not just in terms of sort of Juliet is the sun and we all think she's warm and lovely and bright and fabulous, if we look at metaphors as actually a way of gaining understanding, a way of facilitating comprehension, then let's look at ideas and the metaphors that we use all the time to handle ideas, the way we think about our own thinking. So two of the underlying metaphors that Lakoff and Johnson say that Western culture uses about ideas are buildings and objects. So if you actually look at the language we use, the idea has a strong foundation. The concept stands up to scrutiny. You couldn't knock down that argument. It was very well built. So ideas as objects is another one. They're quite similar. They're linked underneath. So I get what you mean. She put her ideas across effectively. I have an idea. When we're using these words, these terms, we're actually dealing with ideas using the part of our brain that would process how we handle objects. It uses spatial orientation. And in that way, ideas kind of take on this quality of permanence, of distinctness, of separateness, and that we kind of own them in some way, that we have this kind of almost architectural control over our ideas. And I think that in a time where things are becoming increasingly more complex and disciplines begin to bleed out into one another when we're looking at really fundamental questions, I think that these metaphors for ideas, for thoughts, don't serve us very well. And so I'd like to propose, and this is just a kind of experiment really, I'd like to propose an ecology of thought, a way of looking at our thoughts and our concepts as through a different kind of metaphor. This, as opposed to looking at ideas as concrete, as fixed, as static, as objects, I'd like to think of them as a system. I'd like to think of thoughts as alive. I'd like to think of thoughts as interdependent. And I'd like to bring you with me on this kind of thought experiment. thoughts as changing, and thoughts as related to the environment that they occur in. So I'm going to go into this ecology metaphor, which actually expands in more detail, but in 4 topics which are related to ecology, which are ecological niches, and therefore thought niches, mono and multicultures, ecosystems as they apply to ideas, and a kind of microbiome, so our own personal thoughts, our own personal cognition, and how we can treat that in the same way that you have an ecosystem for a whole environment, how we have our own ecosystems inside. So, starting out with niches. So if we look at the ecological environment, if there's a resource available, if there's a gap in the environment, something moves to fill it. It's the way the world works. If there's a resource, there are no gaps. Everything has a sort of a way of flowing into resources that are made available. An ecological example of this is a little comparison between these 2 guys, the lemur and the woodpecker. They both go for the same resource, but interestingly enough, on Madagascar, where the lemurs live, there are no woodpeckers, but the resource is still there. There are grubs underneath the bark of trees. And when there's this gap, there's this thing that something can use to survive, to procreate, to continue its own existence. It moves in to find it. So the lemur, you can't see in this very little photograph, because the photograph which showed the finger was just far too creepy. It has this extraordinarily long finger, it goes on to about here, which it uses like a woodpecker taps. It taps on the bark of trees to find where the grubs are, and then goes underneath to find them. It evolved into that niche. And the argument I'm making, this is a metaphor about sort of metaphors really, is that concepts work in the same way. And that as opposed to in an ecological environment where the compulsion for a living organism is to survive and reproduce, to continue its existence and the existence of its kind in a kind of conceptual level, we have questions. In our thought ecosystems, there are these voids that we need to fill. How do I live my life? Why do I suffer? What happens when we die? How should I treat others? Who are my group? Why do I do what I do? We have these questions that require answering. And there are different thoughts and bodies of thoughts. So if you get loads of little thoughts and they all join up together into a kind of a cellular organism, you get an ideology or a religion or a political philosophy. They move in to fill those spaces. And unless you're consciously aware of which ones are moving in, we often live it in the first person. They happen to us. We take our ideas as something that are kind of innate, or we're compelled to think of them as things entirely in competition as opposed to in cooperation. So yeah, the question would be, if you have a niche in your thought, if the void comes up, you have a question that you need answer, trying to think of the ideas moving into that void and how they fill that void more as not something that's entirely yours or someone else's, but as something that has its almost own autonomous quality. So here's another one, monocultures and multicultures. So this is another strange example. If you have a monoculture in an environmental ecosystem, what tends to happen is that it becomes much less resilient to change. There's an example with bananas that we no longer have, which are a big example of monocultures. The first one at the top is called the Gros Michel, and that was a banana that was all cloned from exactly the same plant and grown in a huge abundance. And it turns out that you've got then all of a sudden this huge resource, and all you need is one thing that can effectively take advantage of that resource, and the entire thing goes extinct. So there was a fungus that emerged that particularly struck the Gros Michel banana. And I think it was called Tropic 3 fungal disease. And it wiped them all out. They no longer exist, they're extinct. And the same thing is very near to happening with the Cavendish banana, which is the one that we all eat today, because they are all exactly the same banana, cloned out 100 times. They don't tend to reproduce. There's no diversity in that particular stock. So if we take this example of a lack of diversity, a monoculture being very dangerous, it puts an ecosystem at risk of change. If something changes and there's no resilience, there's no backup plan, the whole thing collapses. If we think in the same way about our ideas, then we have an issue. If you only have one body of thoughts, whether that be a religion or a particular political position, or a way of dealing with something like death or grief, and it doesn't serve you, when something changes, when something happens, and actually you can't deal with that situation, then you can have a kind of a thought ecosystem collapse. And I'm sure we all know people who, when confronted with a really dreadful situation, were just not equipped. And as a result, very strange things start springing into that ecosystem because there's this vacuum. And someone might turn to a sort of a more fundamental kind of state of mind, or they might start acting quite strangely. So basically, I'm thinking about resilience in our ideas. I'm trying to get us to zoom out from them a little bit so we don't live them so much in the first person that we can kind of, in a weird way, look after our little thought ecosystems. So if change comes, and the world is increasingly more and more full of change, then we can adapt and survive in it. So this is another kind of more complicated sort of version. And this is what would happen if you have a multiculture. And this is a social multiculture, or a way of looking at social groups as they interrelate and interdepend, as they support one another, because that's how they work. So you'd have the individual in the middle, and then all of the social groups that individual is part of. So family, community, peers, workplace, schools. All of these things interdepend and interrelate with each other. And if we just don't look at the social structure, we look at the ideas they give you, the ideas that your parents give you about how to live a good life, the ideas that your schools give you about different kinds of information. If we think of all of these as mutually dependent and robust, and we try and develop them to sustain each other, as opposed to one idea becoming dominant above all of the rest, then we'll end up with a more flexible and robust thought ecosystem that can allow us to survive some pretty turbulent times. So I'm now going to look at like an ecosystem version, so a social thought ecology. So it's not just about you, it's about the ideas that you come into contact with. And so often, they're due to the people that you meet, the groups that you're with, the people you surround yourself with, and this, in a weird way, because our theme for the talk is on interdisciplinary exchange. If you look at an interdisciplinary group or social body, they are robust. If there's a question that comes in that one person can't answer, then another person can. If your belief or concept system falls short of a particular problem or can't answer a question, if you have a larger extended body of people with a more diverse range of thoughts, then you are more likely to be able to handle randomness as it strikes you. And so there are some questions that we should ask ourselves about our own social thought ecosystem. Are you surrounded by those that are like you? Or are you surrounded by those that are different? Do you believe in absolute truths? Because if you do, then all of a sudden you've got a very competitive thought ecology, where one idea is eating up all of the other ideas and there's only one kind of idea left. And is there an ideal thought organism? Because often people are looking for this kind of absolute truth. They're looking for one idea that just beats all the other ideas, clean out the apex predator of concepts. But actually, if you look at a great deal of ecology, the predators and the prey are interlinked. If the predators get too good and all the prey goes, the predators die as well. It's about getting these things in balance. And I think that this ecological metaphor is an interesting way of looking at it in terms of balancing our own thoughts. And so from the social, where you have these group dynamics, to the personal, because inside ourselves, we've got our own little sort of microbiome of thoughts that we carry with us wherever we go. And these are another few questions to ask ourselves. Are your thoughts diverse, or do you end up taking the same pattern when things strike you? So say, for example, you're presented with frustration or something goes wrong. Every time you're frustrated, do you try and solve it with the same thoughts? Do you have the same mechanisms that you bring into play? And if you do, maybe try and diversify them. Maybe try and see if someone else that you know has something that you could bring into your thought ecosystem to help you respond and adapt better. Do you take sides when watching nature documentaries? I thought this might be quite a telling way of figuring out whether your thought ecosystem is kind of monocultural or not. When you see the sort of the leopard attacking the gazelle, and you think, oh no, don't do it. Whereas actually, if you kind of zoom out a little bit, the leopard needs to eat the gazelle, and there can't be too many gazelles, otherwise they'd eat all the grass, and if all the grass went, etc., etc. It's about not taking sides with your own ideas. It's about thinking about your own concepts as if they were all slightly alive. And as a metaphor, that allows us to be a little bit less partisan and allows us to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more open with the way that we think and the way that we acquire, exchange, and sort of crossbreed our ideas. What happens if everything changes? If something fundamental happens and it's dangerous or difficult, how do you react? And would you be comfortable in that situation? Because I think if you do have a robust thought system, if your ecology is diverse, you're more likely to be able to deal with that change. And also, are your thoughts in competition, or are they co-evolving? Because in ecosystems, you have many creatures that, although they seem fundamentally separate, I mean, something as simple as like a bee and a flower, they're not. They're part of the same little systems. They have these little mutual relationships. And if your thoughts can arrange themselves in those kind of mutual relationships, where they support and build up and correspond to each other, as opposed to being absolute truths that require one or the other to succeed, then perhaps we can have a slightly more gentle and, I don't know, diverse way of thinking about things, not taking sides with their own thoughts when the leopard eats the gazelle. And yeah, these are just some questions and a metaphor that I found very useful in organising my own thoughts, and that I thought might be nice to pass on as a metaphor to maybe try out organising your own. Thank you very much.
And that's Julius's work in the show that you forgot to mention. So yeah, the details of those thoughts that you heard and those questions in material manifest in the show, and plenty for you to ponder upon. The next speaker is Silvia Krupinska, and Silvia is going to ground some of those thinkings about those questions in relation to our relationship with water and the environment, and looking specifically at local engagement with your surroundings, where the Walthamstow Wetlands has been her home and her studio and her laboratory for the past 10 months.
I'm Silvia Krupinska. My practice has been mostly sculptural, but there have been some changes which it was part of the journey of my MA, Art and Science, but also the journeys I've been making during my residency in Walthamstow Wetlands. I'll take you briefly on that trip. I just thought maybe I'll point out this cormorant trying to swallow a fish, and it's a bit too big for it. Hopefully this presentation won't be that for me. It all started... Actually, it started back home in Slovakia, where I developed my relationship with nature. I wanted to be on this course because I wanted to make this sculpture of the river where I come from. It was an amazing experience learning the skills of welding and exploring water, which led me on to realizing, actually, now living in London for half of my life, we'll celebrate 1818 in January, I needed to ground my practice geographically here. So what do? It was actually, it couldn't have been easier looking at water and taking a commute to Archway Studios, where we are based. Every time I would past the waterscapes of, I didn't know what they were, and also I was looking into where my tap water comes from. To my surprise, it was just on my doorstep in Walthamstow Wetlands, which became my lab, as Heather pointed out, that's what we do, since August 2015. That's why also I did this drawing, which is there as well. I've got some copies over there if you'd like this limited edition of 60 pieces. Come and pick it up later, it's free. And how does one explore a place? I did it through 3 things: doing installations, collecting materials and images, and also picking up audio on my walks as walk and talks, which you can see later in the exhibition. This is one of the installations, my house. It does really feel a little bit like mine, but I can't have it. And another one is situated around my favorite reservoir in Wetlands, number 1. This platform is there, and I situated the brambles hoop on it as just a symbol or a play, or another language, or exploring a place. And yet, the third one, most exciting for me, was me sitting on a branch of a tree above Coppermill Stream. I wasn't, you see, allowed to interact with water whatsoever because Thames Water said we can't swim in it. So I had to climb up on a tree and take a photo of my installation as it is there. Collection of materials, another way of discovering the place for me was creating inks from berries or spring flowers. And these ones are from the berries, which helped me to even further my practice. So I'll tell you about that later. And there is lots of life and death in the wetlands. Cormorants are there. Fishermen don't like them, but this one, I believe, died really peacefully. There is a violet by its side. It's quite a romantic idea of dying. That brings me on to the unfolding realities piece that I have in the crossing, Studio Hide, which is like the plant. It's also a transplant brought into the urban space. The urban nature reserve, the wetlands, are now in the crossing, and it's a proposal for a for my own studio hide in the wetlands, in one of the hides there, but also collated archives brought together for my guests, the audience, but also for me to spend some time in it and create the work as it is. I do spend a lot of time there now and continue working because this is what I do now. Instead of creating sculptures from steel, I just keep walking through my journeys and evaluate. And next slide. That was something that happened last week during the exhibition. It was a highlight, really, for me. The boy was keen to identify a bird in one of my maps in the installation, and I gave him a book, and he found the bird and he wrote it down, which actually made me realise I would like to do some workshops with children as a continuing of the journey of the wetlands, and perhaps that proposal can extend into community, and they can come in, schools can come in, and we can do something together. It's an ongoing thing, which also meant for my practice. The studio hide gave me time to spend with my work and all these collated materials, and there's also an audio piece which I was listening to while I was dribbling with the inks and paper, just creating marks, and I realized, oh, this is like lines, and I began to just listen and copy the text. And I don't know where will this take me, but it's just another step of journeys, maybe. And you can just read, some like just bits and pieces as they are. They're easier to read on. Thank you very much for listening. Like I said, this is just the beginning, hopefully, for me, of something. Thank you also to my collaborators. And if you liked or would like to go to Wetlands, don't forget to pick up your free copy. And I think that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia. And so Silvia's piece in the degree show is, as she explained, is Studio Hide. So it's a space where she has been working and engaging with people, and they've been interacting with it for the run of the degree show so far. And will you be in situ tomorrow as well? Yes. And as you say, a proposal for a hide to take back into context into the wetlands themselves. So I very much hope that they invite you in. I'd like to introduce our next speakers. Mellissa Fisher is graduating from the MA Art and Science, and she's joined by one of her scientific collaborators, Dr. Mark Clements, who is a microbiologist and bioscientist by training. They work together on one of their projects. So let's get you going. Okay, introduce Mellissa and Mark.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so behind us is going to be a time-lapse video that I've made over the last couple of years, and we're going to talk about our lovely collaboration and how we met.
Is the video playing?
No, it's not actually. So,
All
Mark,
right,
how did we meet?
We're just sorting that out.
So Mel and I first started to work together at the University of Westminster, where we're working on an initiative called Broad Vision, which was bringing together art and science students and staff to work on interdisciplinary projects. And so at that time, Mel was an illustration student, and I was the bioscience lead academic on the project.
And I was a ambitious student, quite keen to go into science, and was particularly fascinated with the invisible world that was on our skin. So I barely knew Mark and decided to corner him in the lab and ask him if I could make a sculpture with agar. And he was like, ooh, I don't know. We tried it out and tested it, and then it worked beautifully. And that led to our exploration with bacteria.
So, so that journey started, and so you can see the piece at the back here, which is made out of agar. Agar is a medium which you can grow bacteria on, and so over time, the bacteria start to grow on the surfaces. And so Mel started to experiment with different types of agar. So in the scientific laboratory, we use different types. They're used for the identification of different bacteria. So if you've got a different type, if you've got an infection, when you have a sample, it can be grown on these agars, and we can identify the type of bacteria and give you the antibiotics. So we started by exploring these agars, and then Mel started to say to me, well, what would happen if I mix this one with this one? I said, you can't do that, it ruins the protocol. But Mel said, come on, let's do it. And so we started to experiment with those forms and got amazing results, which some of them you can see behind. We also started to look at the bacteria. So Mel was exploring her own bacterial flora. So these are sculptures cast from her face with her own bacteria growing on them. And so she wanted to find out more about those bacteria. So we started to stain them, look at them under the microscope. And again, that opened up a different way of seeing. So when I was looking down the microscope, I was trying to identify whether it's a Staph aureus or an Acinetobacter, whereas Mel was looking at patterns and forms and shapes down the microscope and saying, oh, I can see a fetus. I said, no, you can't, you can see bacteria.
So furthermore to this collaboration, we decided to push the project further and apply it to the Eden Project, which is called The Invisible You, the Human Microbiome. It's been there for a year so far, and you've got 4 years left, so hurry, you haven't got long. And then, we just decided to exhibit one of the faces with the time-lapse film that you've already seen. And it's going pretty well, I think. It's still alive.
So Mel says we just exhibited it. Well, it's a bit more complex than that, because when we started to experiment with this, you have to do it in a laboratory. You're growing bacteria on your face, and when the bacteria on your face are in relatively small numbers, they're harmless. The majority of your bacteria are harmless. But on these sculptures, we're suddenly growing them in very large amounts. It creates a health and safety risk. When Mel said that she wanted to publicly exhibit it, I'm thinking, oh, risk assessments. How are we going to do this?
I'm like, what a risk assessment.
Yes. The bit that Mel got excited about was, I told her, you're going to have to take biohazard tape with you because these are a risk. But then it created a challenge about how can you take work which you create within the laboratory and then take that into a public space. How do you ensure the safety of the public? And so again, there was a lot of experimentation about how you can actually contain those pieces of work. One of the biggest challenges was finding a sealant that would actually seal the vessel in which Mel was showing.
And we did actually find bacteria-resistant sealant, which was amazing.
Yes.
Amazing day for me.
Yeah, the early attempts, after a few weeks, then the bacteria were eating away all the sealant, and so then we had all of the very smelly ooze coming out of it.
Mm. So, there are many challenges doing this work and transporting it, as Mark said, and being an artist in a lab as well was really interesting, because around me everyone was doing like their research, PhDs, and they were like, who's this artist in this lab? Like, what the hell is she doing? And the smell as well of the sculptures, because I was doing time-lapse for at least a month, it was open, so people. I wasn't very popular, was I?
No. And yeah, the lab gradually, every time you opened up a fridge or something, you would find one of Mel's faces or different body parts.
And we used to
growing
make
in the
around
lab.
10 at a time as well, so there'd be fridges full of it, and
Yep.
yeah, lots of weird responses. But during this time as well, through my experience on the masters, I went on a residency to Canada, where I explored the world of fungus, which perfect timing. And I became very obsessed with the growth and form of fungus and foraged in forests for it. And also around this time, my collaborators decided to get better jobs and move out of London. So my project has now been pushed in a different direction, and you can see in the space out there. So I guess the amazing part about working with a scientist is how you have to really plan everything, and we'd have 2-hour meetings every week, whereas I'm very much, let's just do it, let's go and make something, and then you'd say it takes, what, a day to...
Yeah, you've got to prepare the media, I've got to sterilise the media, there's a lot of preparation. But yeah, so even if we had the planning meeting, Mel would still come to the lab and say, oh, I've had an idea. And I'm thinking, no, I thought we were going to do this.
But then, like, after getting into those meetings and continuous WhatsApp messages, like, can we do this, can we do that? We got into a kind of routine, and then actually it's bettered my practice because I'm far more organised now and far more experimental with what I'm doing. And I'm not so shocked when things go wrong.
And I think for myself, it's changed my practice as well, that I'm a lot freer in it. As a scientist, that we're very fixated on conventions, and so it freed me up to think and explore my discipline in a different way as well. And so I do more things where I'm just looking to see, well, yeah, let's just try this and see what happens. So I think it's reawakened my curiosity in that sense, and it's also given me an opportunity to engage the public with the work that I do. As a microbiologist, it's very difficult to go out to the public. So if it hadn't been for collaborating with Mel, then my work would stay within the laboratory. I would publish papers which go out to a very small community of similar microbiologists, all interested in the very small minutiae of the discipline.
But this is not the end. We are planning to do much bigger, greater things. We want to bring the microbiology project and build a life-size, full-body sculpture at some point in the foreseeable future. So watch out. We're coming.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you'd like to bring some chairs up, and if I could invite the other two up as well. If you sit in the light, it's kind of in an arc towards the camera. Stage you. Yep, you're good there. Okay, whilst they're being mic'd up, think about what questions and comments you'd like to ask. So I mean, they're very diverse practices, but some commonality in terms of process, ecology, the process of continual change and transition. Does anyone have a question to start with? Yes, we've got here, lots, okay.
Can I have a question for Mark and Mel? Are you quite unique on the MA in terms of this collaboration, or are there other examples on?
I think there's lots of collaborations going on in the course. There's another student doing microbiology as well, and it's very encouraged to collaborate outside of the university, so you gain that experience.
Thank you for all of your talks. Julius, I was particularly interested in how your thought experiments actually turn into the artwork that we saw.
So you can have a conceptual metaphor, which is just a way of understanding one thing in terms of another, if you just look at an idea. But when you start manifesting those in three-dimensional forms, I use pattern. human beings fundamentally at our very core is how we evolved. We are pattern recognizers, we spot patterns. And so I try to tie metaphors into pattern and surface and sculptural form as well. So with the piece outside, all of these different systems that human beings are part of are embedded within a sculptural metaphor of flow. It's in the form of a vortex, and all of these different things are embedded within this sort of this larger macroscopic metaphor of flow. So for me, it's the way you translate a conceptual metaphor into a physical object is through surface, sculptural form, and pattern.
Question also for Julius. A lot of what you said reminds me a lot of Gregory Bateson's work in anthropology.
Deeply inspired by Gregory Bateson.
Okay, I kind of guessed that.
Yeah.
So could you maybe contextualise what you've done related to his research, perhaps?
Absolutely. So Gregory Bateson is, well, he worked in the field of cybernetics, in particular cybernetics and human knowing. And whilst I didn't want to get laden into the terminology, I kind of wanted to present the metaphor as fresh. His approach looks at learning as a system and as information as systems. There's a lot of information theory about the movement of different packets of information in a systemic way. And Gregory Bateson presented a very wonderful book or collection of books, I wrote some essays as well, on this concept of an ecology of ideas, looking at understanding as a phenomena that emerges from the interactions of all of our different thoughts as they combine together. And whilst I'm in no means a cybernetic scholar, I have found that his subtle and rather gentle and beautiful approach to ideas and the way we handle our own ideas is very influential.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Someone just moved their hair. I thought it was a hand. Nathan, do you have a question? Not to put you on the spot at all. Is there anything you haven't asked?
Yes, I have a question for Julius. There's a rather beautiful short story by Borges about a librarian who's producing the ultimate codex of the collection and wonders how he gets the codex into the codex of the collection. So, sense of infinite regression.
Yeah.
How do we avoid infinite regression?
Well, I think it's interesting question, huh? Because within my talk, I'm sure there are metaphors trying to explain metaphors, which themselves are embedded with the metaphors. It all gets a bit tangled. But I think it's the difference between when something is complicated and when something is complex. And it's whether or not it resolves into a different kind of order when you zoom out. For me, comprehension is related to almost scales of observation. And using Gestalt grouping principles on a sculptural level, but also guiding metaphors on a kind of on a conceptual level. I think if you frame it correctly, it reads as one thing, and not as many things. If you look at the human body, say for example, it is comprised of many cells, and those cells take part in tissues, and those tissues form organs, and the organs, in their relativity and interconnection with one another, form the body. And yet we treat the body as a singular thing. We recognize it from afar. But it is not one thing. It is many different things combining and collaborating to form life. So ideally, if I get it right, and I'm still making my way there, you'll be able to collapse the complicated into something that is both complex and also sort of simple on the other side of it.
So a process of complexification. I mean, all the works, I think, have a connection with interconnected systems or processes, relationships with environment, with behaviours, patterns of behaviour. Don't know what the question attached to that comment is. Do you have any questions for each other? We've got a question over there.
You're right. We've got one over here.
I'll come to you in a minute. See if they've got. Did you have anything?
Yeah. I have a question for Silvia, which I'd like answered. which I've always found your practice very sensitive, and I find the way that you gather your artefacts and weave them into your installations very interesting. You've started out with this translation of the auditory journey that you take as well, so sort of soundscapes and the conversations that you have with people. I would really like to know where you're thinking of taking that particular line, if there are any inspirations for you at the moment in that direction.
I will speak up because I haven't got a mic. Thank you. I don't know. This is a new development of my practice that happened 2 days ago. But I have a little bit of background in radio, so maybe I can take it. Oh, I said background. I did one thing, you know. So maybe I can take it further. Maybe I can do my own show about nature and then go on walks. In fact, someone else is doing that on BBC, aren't they? What was the lady's name? Going on walks and talking. Never mind. Yeah, I think maybe going wider and speaking about importance, how I feel, of getting to know your local nature, that we all can relate to it on a deeper level, starting with children and continuing to us. It's just really the simple message I have in my work, and just getting on with it. That's the aim, either way, through sculpture or sound.
Thank you very much.
And when you visit the Studio Height, I would encourage you to listen to the audio, because it really does take you on Silvia's journey into the wetlands. So there are a couple of comments. There's over here and then here.
Well, that sort of answered my question, actually. Well, what I was going to ask, for Silvia, obviously, I mean, your work is refreshingly unpretentious. And I say that as someone who's working in a collaboration which is arguably reasonably pretentious. So I'm wondering, is that something that reflects in all of your artwork? Is it just is it something that sort of you decided when you started this piece to take this particular approach because you wanted this particular feel to the artwork, or is it just sort of who you are as an artist?
It depends on how you define the word, but I think maybe just from experience I've learned that I've got to be firstly true to my own practice and how I feel, and then that's going to just lead me onto something. But I think I'm trying to keep it simple for myself and other people, and that hopefully that way it's going to be easier to read and listen to. And I'm going to actually repeat myself when I say local means easier to access, so simpler, and then we can expand once we know our local to more global. So I'm cheating here when I'm saying that again, but I think that's where it all kind of grounds itself. Yeah.
There's an immediacy, isn't there?
Yeah.
To the tangible, immediate environment that you're within, and then that can be extrapolated out to wider.
I'll just
questions.
add one more thing actually. My work used to be, or I used to enjoy just enjoy the making, and it still is very intuitive. But I wanted to expand this to a more useful approach when I joined this MA Art and Science. That's why I chose this particular course, which helps me to lead that way, because looking at and working, collaborating with scientists, talking with my colleagues, it's rewarding and immediately adds another level of usefulness. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. This is a question to anyone who wants to answer it. I was kind of curious about how your relationship to science has changed or developed over the last 2 years of your course. Does anyone fancy answering that?
I'm sure. I've always found the discipline of science as a way of knowing, or a way of acquiring information, very powerful. Its reductive tools are very strong. Its methods of measurement are very compelling, and it allows you to learn more in a quite specific way. But it allows you to learn a lot about the world around you. But I always saw it as I only really connected with it through its outputs, through the data that it generated, or the ideas or the concepts and the little lumps. But actually, I've been lucky enough to collaborate with some really interesting and very wise people working in systems science, and seeing how it's not just the output, it's the praxis. And the same way that as an artist you think of your practice, right, and how you act as an artist, how you navigate social systems, what you do. It's been interesting meeting with scientists or practitioners of systems science and seeing how they do what they do, and how they make, because we make things manifest, we take our concepts and we make them into objects, but seeing how you take understanding and make it into something else. I've gained a deeper appreciation of that through this course and through collaborations with people outside this course.
Lots of people assume when they see the sculptures that me and Mark have made, they say to me, "Oh, well, you're from a science background, aren't you?" And I'm like, absolutely not. I find it quite difficult, science, still. Like I've been working with it for a few years, but I don't have that sponge brain. I have to really kind of read things and still it just falls out. And that's why I have Mark, my assistant, to help me.
Does he kind of complete the other side of your brain?
It completes me, yeah.
Oh, that's lovely. That's just delightful.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question of all of you, please. What is your academic background, and what do you think triggered your interest to go beyond what your chosen subject has been?
I did a BA in Fine Art at Chelsea 10 years ago.
So go a bit further back. Back to your secondary school and so on. What were the subjects that attracted you then?
Yes, okay. Thank you, that's interesting. Geography was one of my favorite subjects because my neighbor above me, he was my teacher. So that sometimes stuck with me, interestingly. I did lots of sports and lots of art. I wasn't an academic student or child, but I seem to be doing all right. When I was in Slovakia. When I was 18, I took exams in geography, English, Slovak, and French. I did that. Don't remember any other languages, by the way. French, I can't remember French. And then I came here when I was 18. I continued my education here, so that's why I did pre-foundation and foundation in art, and then BA. And now finally, at 36, completing my MA, it's time to stop studying, I think. But I don't know, I think I should move on because I've taken lots of time, but yeah.
The second component to your question was also what drove the change, or the catalytic moment that drew you to other subjects, or was it... I'm just asking about the second component of your question.
Okay. What I'm really trying to understand is what encouraged your interest to go much more broad. That's why I wanted to hear what you did at school before you focused when you went to university, and once you got to university, what was it then that again opened up your horizons? Because we seem to have an opening and closing, an opening and closing, and sometimes it closes and goes narrower and narrower. Absolutely. So this is really what I'm trying to find out from you all.
So it's the context and then how that's led. So for myself, I've always been a bit of a generalist, but with more of an inclination towards the art subjects. I studied the International Baccalaureate at school, which I hated at the time because all of my peers had much more free time than I did. But in hindsight, I'm very grateful for, because that carries all of the subjects through to a later level. And at that point, I learnt about environmental systems and various different subjects. And then at university, I still kept broad. I took a joint honours degree in the history of art and literature. And for me, it's always trying to find a model that can explain all of the things, or to try and find a way of thinking that can reconcile them, because I've always found it very uncomfortable. When, say, for example, I would be writing essays about the history of art or trying to do some research into some sort of philosophical literature, and I'd want to bring in something from over here because it seemed relevant or pertinent, or you'd want to bring in some psychology when you're approaching this subject. It's a continuum. Reality is a continuum, and also ideas and the tools that we use are a continuum. And so I've been trying to find different frameworks for information that allow you to reconcile all of those different things. So for me, the first one was semiotics and the study of meaning, which allowed me to link artworks and literature and text and dance. You have a meaning and the way that you make it. You can dance a state of mind, or you can sing a concept, or you can sculpt a particular political opinion. You have the meaning and the way you make it. So that was my first kind of meta structure that allowed me to link. And then through the course, I was seeking more. I was seeking a way of integrating the sciences into a more humanistic body of knowledge. And actually, through complexity theory and complex system sciences, I found a framework that is more able to reconcile those disparate elements. So I suppose it is a search for a kind of structure that can hold all of these things that has driven me.
Trying to sum up the last 10 years, 15 years. I think I am lucky that I have a beautiful mother who is an artist, and she's very much inspired me to express in that way from a very young age. And I grew up being between art and music at the time, and then I went to Westminster and did illustration, which I found incredibly boring. Everyone was drawing like children's books and painting on plates and stuff, and I was making hamster mazes for my hamster to follow colour and scent, and which worked really well. And then I joined the art and science module which Heather ran at Westminster, and the first time I looked down a microscope, I was like, sold. That's where I'm interested. I'm interested in something you cannot see, like the invisible world is another world that we do not look at enough. And yeah, I think that sums it up.
And then I've always been very much a scientist right from an early age. At home, the house used to be filled with jam jars of the wildlife I would collect and I'd be observing. So all the way through my schooling, I was always more drawn to the science subjects, and then continued then that through university studying broad biology. But the problem is that as a scientist, you become then very specialized in a much smaller area. I think where I've been fortunate is that I've moved. So I started off, I did a PhD in microbiology. I was working with molecular biology. It gave me an opportunity also to work with stem cell biology, which is actually quite a large shift. And I think shifting disciplines, even though it's still within biology, made me approach the discipline from a different perspective than, say, other scientists. Starting to collaborate with artists, the reason why I've gone down that route is the fact that when you are working with artists, that they're willing to ask questions. And so you'll say something, but they'll say, but why? Can you go into it? And as a scientist, we've stopped questioning certain concepts because they become just a subject fact. You just end up saying, well, because it's always been that way. But then it starts to trigger those thoughts within you, and you start to question, you start to look and try your subject in a different way. And so that's why I've been drawn into that collaboration. It's also then moved into my teaching practice as well. And I think that the way that we teach the sciences drives out the creativity that is within science. And so a lot of people ask the question about, oh, you know, the arts is always very creative, but the sciences aren't necessarily. And I think that's just the way that we teach it. So what I'm trying to do is to change science education to actually draw out that curiosity and allow the opportunity for science students to be more creative in the way that they explore the subject.
I think we will take our curiosity now elsewhere. So I'd firstly like to thank our speakers. So round of applause for our second panel.